Imagine you have 10 cookies and all your friends want them. Suddenly, everyone is offering you their toys, their candy, even their lunch money just to get one of your cookies. The price of cookies goes way up because everyone wants them so badly. But then one day, nobody wants cookies anymore. Maybe they found out the cookies weren't as good as they thought. Now you're stuck with cookies nobody will buy, and the price crashes down to almost nothing. That's basically what happens in a housing market crash, except instead of cookies, we're talking about houses worth hundreds of thousands of dollars. Let me tell you something that might surprise you. Houses don't always go up in value. I know. Your parents probably told you that buying a house is always a good investment. And for the most part, over really long periods of time, that's true. But sometimes things go terribly wrong. And when they do, millions of people can lose their homes, their savings, and their dreams all at once. So, what actually causes a housing market to crash? Well, it usually starts when everything seems perfect. Picture this. It's a sunny day in your neighborhood. Houses are selling like hotcakes. Your neighbor just sold their house for way more than they paid for it 5 years ago. Another neighbor sees this and thinks, wow, if I buy a house now, I can sell it later for even more money. This is what we call speculation, and it's like a game where everyone thinks they'll win. Banks see all this excitement, and they want in on the action too. They start giving out loans to pretty much anyone who asks. Now, normally, banks are pretty careful about who they lend money to. They want to make sure you can actually pay them back. But during a housing bubble, banks get a little too relaxed. They start thinking that even if someone can't pay back their loan, the bank can just take the house and sell it for more money anyway, because house prices keep going up. Seems like a safe bet, right? Well, not exactly. Here's where things get interesting. Banks start offering something called subprime mortgages. Think of it like this. You want to borrow your friend's bike, but your friend knows you're not great at taking care of things. Normally, they'd say no. But imagine if your friend thought that even if you break the bike, they could sell it for more than what it's worth. Suddenly, lending you the bike doesn't seem so risky. That's what banks were doing with houses. They were lending money to people who really couldn't afford the monthly payments. Some people were getting loans without even proving how much money they made. We called these liar loans because people could basically just say they earned whatever amount they wanted. Wild, right? I mean, imagine going to a candy store and the owner just trusting you when you say you have money in your pocket without even checking. Now, here's where the story gets even crazier. These banks didn't just hold on to these risky loans. They bundled thousands of them together and sold them to investors as something called mortgage-backed securities. It's like taking a bunch of okay apples and a bunch of rotten apples, mixing them all together in bags and selling those bags to people at the grocery store. The investors thought they were buying safe investments because the bags were labeled as premium quality, but inside there were all these loans from people who really couldn't afford their houses. Everything seemed fine as long as house prices kept going up. People were buying houses they couldn't afford, but they figured they could always sell the house later for more money if they got into trouble. Banks were making tons of money from all these loans. Investors were happy because they thought they owned pieces of valuable mortgages. It was like a big party where everyone was having a great time. But then the music stopped, and it stopped pretty suddenly. You see, many of these loans had something tricky built into them. They had low interest rates at the beginning, kind of like a special introductory offer. But after a few years, the rates would jump way up, and suddenly people's monthly payments would double or even triple. Imagine if your allowance stayed the same, but the price of everything you wanted to buy suddenly doubled. You'd be in trouble, right? That's exactly what happened to millions of people. They couldn't afford their new higher payments. They tried to sell their houses to get out of trouble. But guess what? Everyone else was trying to sell their houses at the same time. Remember our cookie example from the beginning? When everyone is trying to sell and nobody wants to buy, prices fall, and they fell hard. As more and more people couldn't pay their mortgages, banks started taking back houses through something called foreclosure. Suddenly, neighborhoods had empty houses everywhere. These empty houses drove prices down even more because they were like a giant sale sign for the whole neighborhood. If your neighbor's house just sold for half of what houses were worth a year ago, your house is probably worth less now too. The investors who bought those mortgage-backed securities started to panic. They realized those bags they bought weren't full of premium apples after all. Many of those loans were never going to be paid back. Some of the biggest investment companies in the world started losing billions of dollars. Banks that seemed totally safe suddenly didn't have enough money. Some of them actually went out of business completely. This is what happened in the crash of 2008, and it was devastating. People lost their homes. Families had to move. Entire neighborhoods became ghost towns with rows of empty houses. And it wasn't just about housing. When the housing market crashes, it affects everything. Construction workers lose their jobs because nobody's building new houses. Furniture stores suffer because nobody's buying furniture for homes they don't have. Even your local coffee shop might struggle because people in the neighborhood don't have money to spend anymore. The scary part is that this kind of thing can happen again if we're not careful. The warning signs are usually pretty similar. First, house prices start rising really fast, faster than people's incomes are growing. That's a red flag. If houses are getting more expensive, but people aren't making more money, eventually something has to give. Second, banks start lending money too easily again. And third, everyone starts talking about real estate like it's a sure thing, like prices can only go up forever. But here's what you need to understand. Markets go in cycles. They go up and they come down. It's like a seesaw. When everyone piles onto one side thinking it'll stay up forever, eventually that side crashes down. The people who understand this don't panic. They prepare. So what can regular people do to protect themselves? First, never buy a house you can actually afford. I know that sounds obvious, but during housing bubbles, people convince themselves they can stretch their budget. They think their income will go up, or they think they can always refinance later. Don't fall into that trap. If you can't comfortably afford the monthly payment with your current income, wait. Second, have an emergency fund. Life happens. People lose jobs. Medical emergencies come up. If you've got 6 months of expenses saved up, you're much less likely to lose your house if something goes wrong. It's like having a safety net when you're walking on a tightrope. Third, understand what you're signing. Those mortgage documents might seem boring and full of confusing words, but they're incredibly important. Know what your interest rate is. Know if it can change. Know what happens if you miss a payment. Don't just trust that the bank has your best interests at heart. They're running a business. The 2008 crash taught us some hard lessons. It showed us that housing markets can crash, that banks can fail, and that things that seem too good to be true usually are. But it also taught us that markets recover. It takes time, sometimes many years, but they do come back. Today, house prices in many areas are higher than they were before the crash. People who held on to their houses through the tough times eventually saw their values come back. But the people who understood what was happening, who didn't overextend themselves, who saved money and prepared for difficult times, those are the people who survived and even thrived. The housing market can seem complicated with all its fancy terms and complex financial products, but at its heart, it's just about supply and demand. When too many people want houses and not enough houses exist, prices go up. When too many houses sit empty and nobody wants to buy them, prices go down. Everything else, all the mortgages and securities and complicated banking stuff, that's just the machinery that makes the basic principles work faster and sometimes more dramatically. Understanding this stuff isn't just for finance nerds or real estate investors. It's for everyone. Because whether you own a home now, want to own one someday, or just want to understand why your rent keeps going up, the housing market affects your life. Knowledge is power, and understanding how these crashes happen means you can spot the warning signs and protect yourself next time things start to look shaky.